I'm Harry. Most people think that's my real name, but it isn't, and it never mattered much until paperwork got involved. I'm telling you this because I'm old enough now to know when something still itches because it never healed right. My mother was in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and weak coffee. That smell sticks with you. Machines hummed, slow and steady, like they were reminding us that time was still moving, even if she wasn't. Her hand felt thinner than I remembered, skin loose over bone, warm but fragile. When I squeezed it, she didn't squeeze back, but her eyelids fluttered, and I told myself that meant she knew I was there. My brother sat on the other side of the room most days. Raymond. We grew up under the same roof, ate the same burnt toast, learned the same rules. Somewhere along the way, we learned different lessons from them. He always dressed a little sharper than the situation required. Even there, he wore a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to look casual without being it. He said the doctors told him not to expect much. I already knew that. What I didn't know was that while I was counting her breaths, he was counting something else. The house came up in conversation like it always did, sideways, casual. He said the taxes were getting out of hand. He said Mom wouldn't want it to become a burden. He said a lot of things that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too hard at the timing. I nodded more than I spoke. That's something you learn with age. Silence can feel safer than arguing when you're tired and scared. I didn't ask questions I should have. I didn't demand to see papers when my gut told me to. I told myself there would be time later. That's the lie we tell ourselves when we don't want to make trouble. Later. Before I go on, let me say this. If you've ever sat in a room like that, waiting for someone you love to either wake up or leave for good, you know how small the rest of the world feels. Bills, houses, signatures, they all seem unreal. That's the fog I was in. And fog makes it easy for other people to move around without being seen. If you're listening to this and thinking it sounds familiar, maybe because you've lived it, or maybe because you're afraid you might someday, stay with me. Some stories don't offer comfort, but they might offer company. And at my age, company counts for something. The first hint came from a nurse who didn't know she was saying anything important. She was adjusting a monitor, eyes on the screen, and asked if my brother was the one handling the paperwork now. Her tone was light, like she was asking who wanted coffee. I said, paperwork for what? She looked at me then, just for a second too long, and apologized. Said she must have mixed me up with someone else. But she didn't. I could feel it settle in my stomach, heavy and cold. When Raymond came back from getting lunch, I asked him straight. That's another thing age gives you, eventually. Fewer soft openings. I asked what paperwork she meant. He didn't hesitate. That should have told me something. He said Mom had signed some documents earlier in the week. Power of attorney adjustments, some property matters. He said it was all routine. He said it was for the best. I asked when she signed anything because she hadn't opened her eyes properly in days. He smiled, just a little, and said there was a good morning window. Doctors, witnesses, all legal. He had answers lined up like groceries on a conveyor belt. I told myself legality wasn't the same as honesty, but I didn't say it out loud. That afternoon, while he stepped out to take a call, I went through the bag he always carried. I'm not proud of that. It felt like crossing a line I'd spent my whole life respecting, but something in me knew that if I didn't look then, I never would. The papers were there, copies. The house address bold at the top. A sale agreement already dated, not pending, completed. I remember the sound of the machines in the room getting louder in my head, even though they hadn't changed at all. I sat back down before he returned, heart thudding, mouth dry. When he came back, he talked about parking and traffic like nothing in the world had shifted. That's when I realized this wasn't an argument waiting to happen. It had already happened without me. I had a choice then. I could confront him in that room, raise my voice, drag nurses and lawyers and anyone else into it. Or I could sit there, hold my mother's hand, and let the last days she had be quiet. I chose quiet. People like to imagine there's always a right answer in moments like that. There isn't. There's just the one you can live with, and the one you can't. I don't know yet which one I picked. All I know is that when my mother's breathing changed that night, slow and uneven, the house we grew up in already belonged to someone else, and my brother was humming under his breath like a man who'd finally checked something off his list. The night my mother died was quieter than I expected. No dramatic alarms, no rush of feet, just a long pause between breaths that never closed again. The nurse touched my shoulder and said her name once, softly, like she was testing whether it still belonged in the room. Raymond cried. He did it cleanly, controlled, face in his hands, shoulders rising and falling just enough to be convincing. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I watched him from 6 feet away and felt nothing move inside me. Grief had already spent itself on something else. In the days that followed, the house came back into my life like a ghost I wasn't allowed to speak to. Neighbors stopped me at the grocery store. They said they were sorry. They said they heard about the sale and hoped everything worked out. I learned who had known before I did, and it was more people than I was comfortable counting. Raymond handled the funeral arrangements. He asked for my input, the way you ask a child which color plate they want. I let him. I stood next to him at the service and listened to him talk about sacrifice and family, and how Mom believed in unity above all things. I wondered if lying counted as unity when everyone nodded along. Afterward, in the parking lot, he handed me an envelope. He said it was my share. That phrase sat wrong in my ear. My share of what, exactly? A house I hadn't agreed to sell, a decision I hadn't been invited into. I didn't open it there. Old habit. Don't make a scene in public. I waited until I got home, until the door closed behind me, and the quiet felt earned. Inside was a check and a note written in his careful handwriting. He said he hoped this would help me move forward. He said Mom would have wanted it this way. I stared at that check for a long time. The number was generous enough to silence some arguments, not generous enough to erase others. I thought about tearing it up. I thought about calling a lawyer. I thought about driving to Raymond's house and saying the things I'd been storing up since childhood. Instead, I folded the note back into the envelope and put it in a drawer. Here's the part people don't like when I tell this story. I didn't fight him. Not because I was weak, and not because I agreed. I didn't fight because I knew exactly how much energy it would take, and I knew I didn't have it. Grief takes more out of you than you expect. It leaves you negotiating with yourself over small things, like whether it's worth getting out of bed. Weeks passed. The house sold again, flipped, stripped of the things that made it ours. I drove by once, slow, like you do when you don't want to admit where you're going. The porch light was different. The tree Mom planted was gone. I didn't stop. Raymond called less and less. When he did, it was about holidays, logistics, neutral ground. He acted like time was sanding down the edges of what he'd done. Maybe for him it was. One afternoon, months later, I got a letter from the county. Routine, they said. Property records update. I almost threw it away unopened. Something made me read it instead. The sale had been flagged. Not reversed, not challenged. Flagged. A missing signature from an old trust amendment that predated Raymond's paperwork. My name. I'd forgotten it existed. So had he. That letter didn't give me the house back. It didn't even promise me anything. It just reminded me that the story Raymond told himself about how cleanly he'd handled things wasn't as airtight as he believed. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter and felt a strange kind of calm. Not victory, not revenge. Just the knowledge that his certainty had a crack in it. I still haven't used it. I don't know if I will. Sometimes justice doesn't look like courtrooms or raised voices. Sometimes it looks like a piece of paper in a drawer, waiting to see who blinks first. Raymond doesn't know I have it. He talks to me like a man who thinks the past is settled. I let him. There's a difference between peace and a ceasefire, and at my age, I've learned to tell them apart. Raymond invited me to dinner in early spring, said it had been too long, said we were getting older and shouldn't let silence do all the talking for us. His voice had that careful warmth he uses when he wants something to sound settled before it is. I said yes anyway. Habit, maybe, or curiosity. His house smelled like roasted meat and lemon cleaner, everything polished, everything in its place. His wife greeted me with a hug that lasted exactly as long as politeness required. We sat at the table and talked about weather, traffic, mutual acquaintances who had aged badly. No one mentioned our mother. No one mentioned the house. Halfway through dinner, Raymond poured himself another drink and started talking about legacy. That word always arrives dressed up, pretending to be thoughtful. He said he'd been thinking about simplifying things, getting his affairs in order. He said he didn't want confusion later, the way things had been confusing after Mom. I watched his hands as he talked. He still picked at his cuticles when he was nervous. He did it as a kid, too, when he'd already taken something and was waiting to see if anyone noticed. He asked if I'd ever regretted not fighting him. That surprised me. Not the question, but that he asked it out loud. I told him regret isn't a single thing. It's a drawer full of small objects you keep bumping into. He nodded, like he understood. Then he said something that told me he didn't. He said he'd done me a favor. He said the money had probably been easier for me than maintaining an old place full of memories. He said it with a smile that expected agreement. I thought about the letter in my drawer back home, the one he didn't know about. I thought about how easy it would be to slide it across the table, watch his face change, watch certainty drain out of him. I didn't. Instead, I asked him if he ever wondered whether Mom had known what she was signing. The room shifted, just a little. He said of course she had. He said the doctors confirmed she was lucid. He said witnesses were present. He said a lot of words that had nothing to do with my question. I let the silence stretch. That's another thing age teaches you. Silence makes people fill it with themselves. He finally said it didn't matter now, that what was done was done. That was the moment I realized he needed me to believe that more than I did. After dinner, as I was putting on my coat, his wife pulled me aside. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said families have to make hard choices. She said she admired how calm I'd been through everything. I looked at her and saw a woman who'd learned which questions not to ask. I told her I hoped so too. It was true in a way that didn't comfort either of us. Driving home, the road felt longer than usual. Headlights blurred at the edges. I kept thinking about how people mistake restraint for forgiveness. They are not the same thing. A week later, Raymond called me in a panic. He didn't start with hello. He asked if I'd received any mail that wasn't addressed to me. He said there was an issue with some records. He said nothing serious, just a formality. I told him I hadn't noticed anything. That was a lie. It didn't feel heavy saying it. That surprised me. He talked fast, words tripping over each other. He said lawyers were involved. He said it was probably nothing. He said he just wanted to be sure we were on the same page. I asked him what page that was. He paused, long enough for me to hear his breathing change. He said the page where we didn't dig up the past unnecessarily. After the call, I sat in my living room and listened to the clock tick. I thought about the cost of action. I thought about the cost of letting things stand. Neither one was free. I took the letter out of the drawer and read it again. The paper was thin, official, indifferent. It didn't care about motives or intentions. It just stated facts and omissions. I put it back. Not because I'd decided anything, but because I wanted to see what Raymond would do next without my interference. Some people call that manipulation. Maybe it is. At my age, I call it observation. He texted twice that week. Short messages, casual on the surface, tight underneath. I answered politely and said nothing of substance. There's a particular kind of power in knowing more than someone else and choosing not to use it yet. It doesn't feel good. It feels quiet, like standing in a doorway, hand on the light switch, deciding how much darkness you're willing to live with. The first official letter to Raymond arrived 2 weeks later. He didn't tell me about it, but I could hear it in his voice when he finally called. He sounded smaller, like a man who had discovered that a door he'd always assumed was locked had been standing open the whole time. He said there was a review. He said it was procedural. He said nothing would come of it. Then he asked, carefully, whether I remembered Mom talking about the old trust amendment. He framed it like nostalgia, like a shared memory we might laugh about if it turned out to be nothing. I told him I remembered a lot of things about Mom. I didn't specify which ones. That night I dreamed about the house. Not the way it looked at the end, stripped and repainted, but the way it was when we were boys. The porch sagged in the middle. The screen door snapped back too hard. You could smell the lemon oil Mom used on the table before Sunday dinner. I woke up with that smell in my nose and had to sit on the edge of the bed until it faded. Raymond started calling every few days. Each call was a little more honest than the last. Not because he wanted to be, but because fear peels people open whether they like it or not. He said the buyer was asking questions. He said his lawyer wanted affidavits. He said timelines were being examined. He never said sorry. That absence told me more than any apology could have. One afternoon, he came by unannounced. That surprised me. He'd always preferred controlled settings. Restaurants, offices, anywhere with an exit strategy. Standing in my doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, he looked older than I remembered. He asked if he could come in. I said yes. I offered coffee. He declined. His hands shook when he finally said my name. He asked me, directly this time, whether I had something. Not whether I knew something. Whether I had something. I could have ended it then. I could have said yes and watched the color drain out of his face. I didn't. I asked him what he thought I had. He sat down heavily and rubbed his temples. He said he'd made a mistake. He said he thought he was doing what needed to be done. He said he hadn't meant to cut me out. Not really. He said a lot of things that circled the truth without landing on it. I listened. That's been my role in our family longer than I care to admit. When he finished, the room felt emptier, like air after a storm that never quite breaks. I told him I believed he thought he was right. That wasn't a lie. I also told him that thinking you're right doesn't make you careful. He asked what I wanted. That question sat between us, heavy as furniture. What I wanted wasn't something he could give me. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It was the feeling that I hadn't been erased while I was holding our mother's hand. I told him I wanted him to tell the truth, to the lawyers, to the buyer, to himself. I told him I wouldn't lie for him. I didn't say anything else. He left without finishing the conversation. Another family tradition. Weeks turned into months. The review dragged on. Nothing exploded. Nothing resolved cleanly. That's how these things usually go. Life prefers attrition to drama. The buyer backed out. Not because of me, but because uncertainty scares people with options. The second buyer offered less. Raymond complained about it like the loss was personal. I didn't comment. Through it all, I kept the letter where it was. Not hidden, not displayed, present. I wasn't waiting for the perfect moment. I was watching what kind of man my brother would be when no one was forcing his hand. One evening he called and told me he'd decided to set aside money for a legal settlement if it came to that. He asked if that would make things easier between us. He sounded tired. Older than me somehow. I told him ease wasn't the same as repair. He didn't argue. After the call, I sat alone and wondered whether my silence had become its own kind of cruelty. That's the morally uncomfortable part people don't like to sit with. Withholding can hurt as much as taking. Sometimes more. I thought about our mother. About the way she used to say boys grow into their choices whether they like it or not. I thought about whether she would recognize us now. I didn't try to answer it. The house eventually sold again, lower than before. Raymond took the hit. He never said it was because of me. He never said it wasn't. Some truths live in that gap. We speak less now. When we do, it's polite, careful, like people who've learned where the thin ice is and have agreed not to test it. The letter is still in my drawer. Some nights I think about throwing it away. Other nights I think about keeping it forever. Both feel like decisions. I haven't made either one yet. Time does what it always does. It moves on without asking whether you're ready to follow. A year passed after the house sold the second time. Then another. Raymond and I settled into something that looked like peace from a distance. Birthday calls, short texts on holidays, updates about health that stayed safely on the surface. I never brought up the letter. He never brought up the review again. We both acted like men who had learned where not to step. Then his health faltered. Not dramatically. Nothing that makes a good story. Just enough to slow him down. Enough hospital visits to remind him how thin control really is. He called me one afternoon from a waiting room and said he was scared. He didn't dress it up. That was new. I listened. I didn't offer reassurance I didn't believe in. I told him fear makes sense when you start seeing limits. He laughed softly and said I always had a way of saying things that stuck. A few weeks later, he asked me to come with him to meet his lawyer. He said he wanted things clean. He said he didn't want loose ends. I knew what he meant, even if he didn't say it outright. In that office, surrounded by framed degrees and neutral furniture, he admitted the omission. Not fully. Not the way confession works in movies. He framed it as oversight. He framed it as pressure. He framed it as something that happened too fast. The lawyer listened and nodded and took notes. I sat there and watched my brother age 10 years in an hour. When we left, Raymond asked me quietly whether I was going to use what I had. He didn't ask how I knew. He knew. I told him I already had. Just not the way he thought. What I meant was this. I had used it to decide who I wanted to be in the last stretch of my life. I had used it to stop waiting for him to become someone else. I had used it to accept that justice doesn't always need a stage. He didn't understand that answer. That was fine. Understanding isn't required for things to be true. A month later, he amended his will. He did it voluntarily, no pressure, no threat. He adjusted things in a way that acknowledged what he'd taken without ever naming it. He didn't apologize. He didn't thank me. He just did it. That's the closest we came to resolution. We don't talk about the house. We talk about doctors and weather and the cost of groceries. Sometimes he asks about memories from when we were young. Sometimes I answer. Sometimes I don't. The letter is still in my drawer. The paper has yellowed at the edges. It's less powerful now, legally speaking. Time does that too. It turns leverage into memory. Do I regret not using it to hurt him the way he hurt me? Some days, yes. Especially when I remember how small my mother's hand felt in mine while he was signing papers. Other days, I'm glad I didn't turn my last years into a courtroom. Here's what I know. Betrayal doesn't always end with a bang. Sometimes it ends with a quiet rearranging of distance, a recalibration of trust that never quite goes back to where it was. I didn't forgive my brother. I didn't punish him either. I watched him live with the knowledge that he'd almost lost more than a house. That knowledge sits heavier on some people than consequences ever could. If you're listening to this and thinking about your own family, about something said or done that never got resolved, I won't tell you what to do. I'll just say this. Pay attention to what costs you sleep and what costs you pride. At this age, I've learned you rarely get to save both. I still think about my mother in that hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, the steady hum of machines. I think about how love can exist alongside disappointment without canceling either one out. That's not closure, it's just where I landed. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, pass it along to someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes sharing a memory is the closest thing we get to setting it down.